In this video, we look at a dealer from Blackpool who was robbed of a large consignment. He claimed he didn't know the burglars, but behind closed doors, he recognized one of the men. What followed was a brutal plan for revenge that would turn deadly. Blackpool, a seaside town once known for its bright lights and bustling tourism, has seen darker days in recent years. Beneath the surface of its vibrant promenades lies an underworld where drugs and crime thrive. Like many towns across the UK, Blackpool has become a hotspot for organised drug activity, with rival groups competing for control of the lucrative trade. It's not uncommon for disputes in the area to erupt over territory, debts or robberies, leading to violence that spills out onto the streets. These conflicts don't just involve the major players, but often drag in smaller dealers and even users caught in the crossfire. One name that became part of this world was John Hutchinson, a 44-year-old with a history in Blackpool's gang scene. Known locally, Hutchinson wasn't a kingpin, but he wasn't just a small-time player either. He moved in circles where money, product, and grudges were a dangerous mix. On the other side of the story was Daniel Cunningham, 33, who also operated within this world. Cunningham's name came to the forefront in April 2023, when a stash of drugs was stolen from his home during a break-in. This theft was more than just a loss of product. It was a blow to his reputation, something no one in that game can afford. There's no room for weakness. A single act of disrespect, like the robbery at Cunningham's home, can ignite a chain reaction of retaliation and violence. And in this case, it did. The events that followed would turn one man's anger over stolen goods into a fatal pursuit of revenge, dragging in accomplices and leaving behind a trail of destruction. It's a story that shows just how quickly things can spiral out of control. It was the early hours of April 10th, 2023, when Daniel Cunningham was startled awake by a noise coming from downstairs. Still half asleep, he strained to listen. It sounded like a door opening, followed by heavy footsteps in the kitchen. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the house fell silent. Cunningham climbed out of bed, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. Suddenly, the footsteps started again, this time running, heading straight for the stairs. Before Cunningham could react, 4 masked men burst through the bedroom door. One of them was armed with a hammer. He stepped forward and demanded to know, "Where's the gear?" Cunningham didn't argue. He revealed the location of the stash, a sizable quantity of product hidden in the house. Without hesitation, the men grabbed the stash and fled quickly. As the men escaped, Cunningham's panicked girlfriend dialed 999. Police arrived at the house not long after. When questioned, he claimed the men had demanded money and valuables, but insisted he didn't recognize any of them. But behind the scenes, Cunningham wasn't as clueless as he seemed. He recognized the voice and the eyes of one of the men during the break-in, details he chose not to share with the authorities. Rather than let the police handle it, Cunningham began making his own plans. Within an hour of the robbery, he was on the phone to his contacts in Merseyside, calling for backup to recover what was his. What started as a robbery would soon escalate into something far deadlier. From this moment on, Hutchie was living on borrowed time. Cunningham reached out to Lee Clark and David Bond, both aged 33 and based in Liverpool. These men were no strangers to violence, and they had the kind of reputation Cunningham needed to make a statement. On the call, Cunningham laid out what had happened and identified John Hutchinson, one of the men who had stolen his drugs. Clark and Bond didn't hesitate. They got in their car and drove straight to Blackpool. Cunningham was already working with Darren McCabe, a 47-year-old local with a knack for finding people. McCabe agreed to help track down Hutchinson and was reportedly paid a significant amount for his role. His job was to locate Hutchinson and relay his whereabouts to Cunningham and the Merseyside men. With the team in place, the plan began to take shape. McCabe's efforts soon paid off. He discovered that Hutchinson was hiding out at a friend's house on Scorton Avenue in Blackpool. He passed this information to Cunningham, Clark, and Bond, who were now determined to send a message. The three men prepared for what was to come. Clark and Bond were armed and ready. They gathered weapons, including a hammer, to ensure their message would be crystal clear. As night fell on April 10th, 2023, Daniel Cunningham, Lee Clark, and David Bond arrived at Scorton Avenue, the location Darren McCabe had pinpointed as John Hutchinson's hiding spot. Hutchinson had taken refuge at a friend's flat, lying low with the stolen drugs. His plan was to let the situation cool off before moving the product on, but Cunningham had other ideas. The trio approached the property with purpose, weapons in hand, a hammer, a metal bar, and other weapons. The plan was not subtle. McCabe stayed behind in the car, ready to drive them away once the job was done. Cunningham, Clark, and Bond forced their way in through a kitchen window, breaking the hinge to crawl inside one by one. Once inside, the sound of their entry startled Hutchinson. Realizing the danger, he bolted for the door, but Bond was faster. A hammer blow to Hutchinson's back sent him crashing to the floor. From there, the attack worsened. Clark and Cunningham joined in, delivering repeated blows with their weapons. Hutchinson was beaten with the hammer and metal bar, while they stamped on his head to ensure he couldn't fight back. The flat turned silent, save for the sounds of the assault. Meanwhile, a neighbor who had seen the men break in had called the police. Hutchinson, lying bloodied and broken on the floor, gave up the location of the stolen stuff. Cunningham and his crew grabbed the bag and fled the flat, running straight to McCabe's car waiting outside. McCabe, the lookout and driver, sped them away from the scene. Back at Cunningham's house, the stolen gear was returned and the group split up. McCabe, seemingly unfazed by the night's violence, made his way to a local pub, where he was later seen drinking casually. When the police arrived at the flat, they found Hutchinson alive, but in a critical state. Refusing to name his attackers or accept medical help, he downplayed the incident. However, the damage was done. By the time Hutchinson collapsed later that evening, it was already too late to save him. Later that evening, at approximately 9:10 p.m., emergency services were called back to the same address after Hutchinson suffered a cardiac arrest. He was immediately transported to Blackpool Victoria Hospital for medical treatment. Hutchinson succumbed to his injuries shortly thereafter. A post-mortem examination revealed that he died from a ruptured spleen, leading to fatal internal bleeding. This catastrophic injury was caused by a forceful hammer blow that fractured a rib that caused the perforation. Following the attack on John Hutchinson, Lee Clark and David Bond returned to Liverpool. Seemingly unfazed by the events that had just unfolded, it later emerged that the two exchanged texts that night, laughing about their actions. Bond, feeling the effects of the assault, messaged Clark, "Lad, my foot's killing me." Clark, in turn, replied, "Took me back to the good old days, that did." The conversation then turned to Bond's partner, who wasn't pleased with his involvement. Bond said, "My bird is fuming," but shrugged it off, adding, "She's all right, just got a cob on. I said I only drove." Cunningham soon joined the group chat, sending his gratitude. He messaged Clark, "Thanks, brother, for everything, fam. You and the other fella. Tell him thank you." Bond, however, became cautious and gave Clark a warning. "Make sure he gets rid of the hammer and get all that stuff in a fresh JD bag." The hammer, now a key piece of evidence, was their biggest risk, and Bond wanted it gone. But when news broke that John Hutchinson had died from his injuries, panic set in. Clark and Bond exchanged worried messages as the reality of their actions hit. "What if I did it?" Bond asked Clark, who tried to reassure him. "A hammer to the back ain't doing that, bro." The texts showed a chilling mix of calmness, bravado, and eventual fear as they realized the consequences of their actions. What began as a joke about their night of violence quickly shifted into the realization that they were no longer just enforcers. They were now facing the weight of a murder charge. The day after John Hutchinson's death, the police made their first move. At 1:15 p.m. on April 11, 2023, officers arrived at Daniel Cunningham's home on Tarnbrook Drive, Blackpool, to arrest him. Cunningham answered the door while on the phone with Lee Clark. As soon as Clark informed David Bond that Cunningham had been taken into custody, Bond reportedly told him, "Launch your phone." It was a clear attempt to destroy evidence and distance themselves from the attack. Cunningham, however, was uncooperative. During his police interview, he gave a no-comment response to every question. The next arrest came at Lee Clark's home on Greenall Close in Merseyside. Unlike Cunningham, Clark admitted to breaking into the flat, but his statements were an attempt to shift blame. He referred to John Hutchinson as the baldy one, a description that didn't match the victim. Clark also claimed that it was David Bond who had used the hammer during the assault, though he insisted he hadn't seen the weapon until after they'd left the scene. David Bond, whose involvement in the attack was becoming clearer, was arrested soon after. Bond's silence in the group chat, alongside Clark's statements, only raised suspicions further. Darren McCabe, who had served as the getaway driver, was arrested in Talbot Road, Blackpool. Like Cunningham, McCabe also gave a no-comment interview, but attempted to distance himself from the events. He claimed Hutchinson was a good friend and denied any involvement in the assault. Despite their efforts to shift blame or remain silent, the evidence against the four began stacking up. Clark's confession, Bond's attempt to destroy his phone, and Cunningham's connection to the planning made it clear that all four men had played critical roles in the events that led to Hutchinson's death. Lee Clark and David Bond were charged with murder, reflecting their direct and violent roles in the attack. Daniel Cunningham and Darren McCabe were charged with manslaughter, acknowledging their part in orchestrating and facilitating the assault. The arrests and subsequent interviews painted a picture of panic and self-preservation. Cunningham's phone call, Clark's confession, and Bond's "launch your phone" instruction revealed a group scrambling to cover their tracks. But it was already too late. The net had closed around them. In January 2024, the trial of Daniel Cunningham, Lee Clark, David Bond, and Darren McCabe commenced at Preston Crown Court. During the trial, additional details emerged that shed light on the events leading up to and following the attack on John Hutchinson. The prosecution revealed that earlier on April 10, 2023, Hutchinson, known as Hutchie, received a text message from a friend, Danny McManus, inquiring if he was up for a graft. Subsequently, Hutchinson met with Ben Hudson around 12:30 a.m. before they headed to Cunningham's house. The court was presented with the text message exchanges between the defendants following the assault. The prosecution highlighted that the decision to use a hammer in the retaliatory attack was deliberate, mirroring the weapon Hutchinson had employed during the initial robbery on Cunningham. After careful deliberation, the jury reached unanimous verdicts. Lee Clark was found guilty of murder. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 27 years. David Bond was also found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. Daniel Cunningham was convicted of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 18 years, with an additional 6 years concurrent and 2 years consecutive for drug offenses. Darren McCabe received a 16-year sentence for manslaughter. This was the game they chose. Plans were set in motion, and everyone played their part. It didn't matter who was right or wrong. Once it started, there was no going back. In the end, this is how it goes. Some walk, some fall. At the end of the day, when the lines are crossed, revenge gets taken. No one stops to think about the fallout until it's too late. For more raw and real crime stories, hit the like button and subscribe. Until the next episode, stay alert and stay safe.